Okay, panel. A number of these are general questions, so I'll start off with a general question. 1966. That's right. Who scored the winning goal? I'm not going to mention that game, I have to say. Imagine me mentioning that, goodness me. Okay, the first question is, with a room of people invested in change, where do we start to make a difference? So with a room of people invested in change, where do we start to make a difference? Who'd like to go first? Peter.
This Drucker quote, which is, best way to predict the future is help to create it. I think we have the wherewithal in this room to make a real difference, as a number of us have commented. And so I think at the end of the day, it's about what we want to do to continue this kind of dialogue and connection and move the agenda forwards and make stuff happen. Willie and I were talking earlier about, but this is a great big oil tanker we've got to shift. Well, I don't think of things like oil tankers anymore. I think like shoals of fish. And yeah, shoals of fish tend to follow each other. So what we're going to do is find a few leading lights of the front end of the shoal of fish and move them, and then other things will follow. So I think the biggest thing, particularly when you're confronting the sort of level of change we've been talking today, is kind of where do I start and what do I do, and do I have any opportunity to change? And the answer is yes, we absolutely do. And I think this is one of the wonderful things about Scotland is we can get a whole group of influencers in a room and we can kind of get our arms around each other and do something about it. And I think that's what we're all very keen to do.
Yeah, thanks. Any other comments in the panel?
Yeah, I'll just second that. And I said it is an incredible opportunity here that you can have government and industry and academia all together to try and sort these things. Obviously, the country I come from, it's a little bit more challenging. It's so much harder to get your arms around some of these opportunities. I think the other thing that everybody can do is not to just go back and kind of go back to the routine when they go back to their offices tomorrow. I know we heard about not using the P word. There's actually something that we've started to use ourselves and we're teaching our students, and that is to ask questions not in a negative way, but in the how might we, and to really think about a positive approach to problem solving. And I completely agree, you can't do everything overnight, so pick one or two, but there are so many things that just came out of the sessions today. So I would say as change makers, start to bring change instead of just accepting status quo.
I will follow on the same line. I think where to start, we start with ourselves. So you start with yourself. And the easiest thing to start with is to change the language that we use to describe our situation. I believe that we exist on 4 levels. Imagine something like an iceberg. So the top of it is the behavior level, but below the behavior, which is right under the sea level, is our awareness, and below that is the stories that we tell, and right at the bottom is the language that we use. So when we change the language that we use, whether it's asking the question differently, whether removing the P word, whether saying, instead of saying but, we say and, any change in language will help us change the story that we tell about ourselves and how the world works. And that will help us ultimately have a more sustainable change in behavior. So let's just change a word. Let's start addressing the people differently and see the magic. It's literally will change the world, because we live in a world that is made out of our words. And our words is something that we can control and change, I believe.
Jackie?
I love that idea of the base of a pyramid. We see as a pyramid more than an iceberg, and hopefully more durable in some respects. And I think there is something about refreshing and renewing that base of the pyramid. I would say that we can all do something, and I would hope that we would all do what we can and then share our experience of that so that we can continue to learn from each other.
Thank you. Anthony?
I think what I'd say is that we need to try and have a kind of sharper sense of what we think the problem is and what the solution is. Maybe simplify it down a little bit, in that we kind of know in the OECD we've got a big multi-year project which is around inclusive growth. You know, growth has been a really important thing for economies for forever, but I think we can very clearly realise that if it's not inclusive, we kind of sow seeds which are going to be really damaging for the long-term prospects of our societies and economies. And the same way as in employment and education, we've seen education become more and more divorced from the world of work. And our solution is, well, we kind of need to bring them back together. And we need to find ways, in multiple ways, of just pulling them back together. And we can see the way this is a problem in that, you know, people are more highly educated, young people more highly educated than ever before. Any generation in history going to the world of work with more qualifications than those more years of education, but yet they're really struggling to find their feet. And so it's not just about kind of the level of growth, it's not just about the level of education, it's about kind of the context within which, the social context within which that exists.
And participate in your next survey would be one of the,
If you wouldn't mind.
one of the things to do. Good, thank you. This is a question for Peter. How do we better link skills strategy and industrial strategy in Scotland? Damien?
Yeah, I think this is one of the, because if you said, okay, skills strategy is about, to some degree, the supply side, and industrial strategy is more about the demand side, then as we've all explored, it's how do you get these two things together? You know, I think I said in my talk, and I express this in many different contexts, that I get very frustrated in this country about our inability to have an industrial strategy that seems to endure for more than the life of not even a parliament, but a minister who's responsible for it. And if you compare us to, say, Germany, and I can't remember if I talked about this because I forget which talk I did, but anyway, Germany has much more enduring industrial strategy. It lasts for years. And their one now is Industry 4.0. And then it's immediately into the debate about skills. So as I said before in answer to your first question, really, I think you have agency in Scotland. I think you have that ability. I think you've gone through things like the Wood Commission. You've got Scottish Enterprise. You're looking at these things in terms of what is the future for Scotland in terms of its industrial base. Where should we most invest? Where's our opportunity? And then you've got your handle on many of the levers of the supply side too, from apprenticeships and the educational system, which is different. And I think you have that opportunity. But I think we've all expressed the fact that without bringing these two things together, we will continue, and it'll get worse, that the mismatch that we have between education and work will continue.
Yes.
But it's drilling it down also from that very high level into, okay, but it's also about how local business can work with local colleges and local communities and through your chambers and all these other things. It's both about the macro as well as about the micro, which is back to my point about agency. We sometimes think, oh my God, until somebody solves out the big picture stuff, I can't get on with what I need to do here. Well, yes, we can. And I think there's some great examples everywhere I see of local colleges, local educational institutions working with local business, saying, what do you most need? How do we work together? How do I bring work experience to your students? And all these sorts of things. So I think you can operate on several levels, but I would love to see that big level of debate really happening in Scotland, and Scotland standing up and say, we know what we're doing on this stuff. Because I think you do. I think you're further down the track than we are anywhere else in the country.
You were sharing with me at the break that in England, the nearest equivalent to SDS was wound up through budget.
Yeah, the UK Commission for Employment and Skills. Which it's austerity. I mean, who the hell knows? But it's such a mistake at the point in time when we're all trying to understand what's going on and recognise we are at this inflection point, and we need that kind of insight. So.
Good, thank you. Next question is one for the entire panel, and it's for those on benefits and low incomes. Things are getting tougher. How aware of this do we need to be, and what do we need to do to support all? ? So it's for those on benefits and low incomes, things are getting tougher. How aware of this do we need to be, and what do we need to do to support all ? Wants to go first? Peter, you want to go first?
I don't want to talk too much, but the answer is very aware. I mean, this is again a subject I'm very passionate about. We have growing inequality and division in many senses. I mean, you can look at this as a macroeconomic level. You're probably all aware that average income, average wages in this country in real terms has declined since the global financial crisis. You're probably also aware that if you look at macroeconomic statistics going back to the late 1990s, that although we talk about productivity being the driver of wages growth, actually they've become disconnected. and this debate between labour and capital. It used to be that capital, i.e. money, could be spent to enhance the productivity of labour. Well, unfortunately, what's been happening, particularly with robotics and automation, is capital can displace labour. So then labour's voice is losing out, and we're in this weird situation which I can see no precedent for, where we have very high employment, we're almost at full employment, so there's a supply-side pressure on the market for skills, and yet average wage is not growing. They are growing at the top level, and there's a real issue, and we've been very vocal in the CIPD about this disparity of growth for executive pay versus average pay, and that is unsustainable and it's unfair. And we've got to find the mechanisms that spread wealth more evenly. And particularly when you add in all this automation and robotics stuff, which is why people talk about other ideas like universal basic income or whatever. I've been sitting on a national forum around employer ownership as a means of spreading wealth. Because we have got to give more voice to the average and particularly low-skill jobs and people. We've got to see how we create fair environments, support them out of low-wage jobs as well. This is not just about paying low-wage people more, showing them progression routes, which we don't do enough of in business, and then finding the ways to distribute the wealth in far more equitable ways than we've had in the past. And that is not some socialist agenda. That is a fundamentally human agenda, and it will get worse with technology unless we really find ways to crack this.
Jackie?
Yeah, two things. Inequality is bad for all of us, but it's also a terrible waste of human potential, and I think we all have a responsibility to be conscious of that and to try and reduce it. The second thing is that we're already increasingly separate from each other in many ways across society in all kinds of countries. We have somewheres and anywheres. We have people who feel that they have benefited from global trends and economic growth, and we have people who feel left behind and that it's not for them and that it's not something they can participate in. And as we grow more unequal, we grow more separate from each other, and the more separate we grow from each other, the harder it is to bridge and come back together, particularly as your sphere of activity and the people you become in contact with are like you or less diverse. So it's, I think, in everybody's self-interest to do everything that we can to try and be very aware of that and actively reduce it.
Yeah, absolutely. Robin, do you have a...
Yeah, I mean, I speak a lot about education. I think a lot about sort of the new generation that we need to prepare. But there's no doubt that there are many people who are already working who are missing some of these critical skills. I think it opens up opportunities. Like, we have to think about how do we bring education into the workforce in a more systematic way. And then the question is, what are you teaching? So, our hope is, as we're just starting to talk about these core skills that are used throughout every function in every organization, people just start to adopt them into a curriculum that is relevant for whether they're workforce or whether it's a, extended learning education. We do have graduate programs and that type of thing so that we're reaching some audience, but those are more educated. So, I think it is just an opportunity as a society to come together and say, how do we put programs together that will benefit everybody and start to equal the playing field to some degree?
Yeah. While the question may seem to be focusing on Scotland, I may not have all the data, but I will try to answer. So how aware we should be? We should be very aware. We should be very empathetic. And I think the situation is really relative from one place to the other. But the answer is always education. How do we make education accessible and useful and meaningful? While I was listening, what goes in my mind, someone who is in Syria who had nothing to do with the conflict, suddenly they are taken out of their schools for years. They are taken out of the school system. But at the same time, I see entrepreneurs and people trying to help them through bringing, very innovative technology-based platforms to actually keep the kids there, because if we lose this generation, what's going to happen. You are feeding into terrorism and into all sorts of things. So I think we as educators, as policymakers, as people who could influence things even a wee bit, as you guys say, we have to be very, very aware, and we have to make education really that meaningful for everybody.
Yeah. Anthony?
When I was talking about inclusive growth a bit earlier, I think some of the points that Peter was making just now were the sort of things which were kind of in the minds of many governments about what the future is going to look like and the need for stability in the future. I think there's kind of two things. One is that, you know, one of the kind of the backdrop of what we've been talking about today is, you know, unpredictable technological change, where we expect you know, jobs to radically transform, jobs to disappear, to emerge overnight. And that's a labour market which is far more dynamic than perhaps what we've been accustomed to. And you know, there's sometimes there's a policy rhetoric around unemployment which is, you know, kind of blaming people for their own misfortune. But we're in a situation where we expect a dynamic economy to generate jobs and jobs to disappear. And I think perhaps in all of our trades, and sometimes actually people, a friend of mine works in the city and he's earned very good money for many, many years, but he thinks his job's going to disappear and be automated pretty quickly. He may well be sort of like signing on. And in that basis, I think we need to, you know, perhaps change the way we think about benefits and welfare as support systems within our countries, because it is something which we think is going to, could affect, is kind of part and parcel of a dynamic sort of labour market. And the other thing is that we kind of do know that, you know, skills do insulate people against kind of risk of unemployment. And the best thing we can do is when people are out of the labour market is to support them to build their skills, and whether they're codified by qualifications, that's probably better because it trades better in the labour market or not. But you know, thinking about making prioritising that skills development at a time when people do have you know, kind of the opportunity to, you know, kind of think afresh about where they are in the labour market. I mean, that is important. So I think we could be more strategic about tackling sort of unemployment, and probably less emotional about it.
Thank you. The next question is for Robin. And is, can the Minerva model be scaled? If so, how? An easy question for you, Robin.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It can in a couple of different ways. So the beauty of leveraging a technology platform to offer classes is you can offer as many classes. We're not confined, at least at Minerva, right, by physical classroom space. It's fairly easy to actually go out and get more residential space. That's much more plentiful, but we don't have to confine any limits. So within our own institution, we will always keep class sizes at 19 students or fewer. We just believe that interaction is really, really important. But we're also working on models to scale this even bigger for institutions who do have means to educate larger numbers of students and may still want that small class interaction, by taking essentially our platform and scaling it to be able to handle hundreds of students at a time. So it's a bit more of a hub and spoke model. It's still all fully active learning. It may just mean instead of a faculty member that has a PhD leading the class, it may be an extended spoke model where you might have TAs, where many universities leverage graduate students and TAs in the classroom, helping to run some of those smaller class sessions, and then they still come together as a broader unit to learn from the faculty member. So we are looking at ways to scale the things we're doing. What we know matters. A curriculum matters. A scaffolded curriculum where there are clear learning objectives and you're measuring against them, that matters. Active learning matters, that they're engaged with the content. Feedback matters. So when we look at those things, as long as we can retain that, we think we can leverage some of the technology we've built to be much more scalable.
Great, thank you. So another question, general question for the panel. How do we bring these EI skills into Scotland? A culture of performance management and individualism, question mark. And it says here, dash, the P word is big here, exclamation mark. So how do we bring these EI skills into Scotland? A culture of performance management and individualism. Who would like to go first? Mushtaq, has to be you. The P word.
Sure.
P word has taken over the symposium.
So it's very interesting because I'm, you know, every time I share a similar thing at my university, some people would like it, some people would think that this is, even almost not appropriate to discuss some of these things. I've heard stuff like the happiness word is fluffy, is lightweight, is non-British. I mean, that's what I was exactly told by. So I made a presentation, interestingly, a couple of weeks ago to the court of our university, and I said that I think the university should focus on developing resilient, emotionally intelligent, and happy graduates. And the chair of court asked me this question: how would you sell this in Scotland? And my answer was this. I told her, have you read a book with the title A Theory of Moral Sentiment? And she said, oh yes, that book. So Adam Smith has two books, The Wealth of Nations everyone read, and the other book that nobody read. So when I took the book and I did a word search, the word happiness was mentioned 163 times. So I said, happiness is a Scottish product. Own it.
Don't know if anybody else wants to follow that, or we'll move on to the next.
Wonderful, Mushtaq. But yeah, I mean, I've worked in lots of different cultures, and the first thing is there are so many fantastic things about the Scottish culture, and you have such an incredible heritage, and your engineers, your economists, your sports people, all these sorts of things. But it is important to understand cultural difference and to celebrate it. We don't all have to be the same. But I think what we're all acknowledging is that we can embed more of this thinking in our educational system and all help each other. But you give it a Scottish context, you put it in the context of Scotland and Scottish culture and Scottish beliefs. So I think that's how you have to think about this. And certainly the other final thing I'd say is we are all human, right? And whilst we talk about all these things, empathy, it's a very human thing, right? And because we're Scottish or we're Malaysian or whatever, it doesn't make any difference. We've still got this gene in us, this thing about what makes us truly human. And one of the things that makes us truly human is empathy and emotional intelligence. Yes. But as Mushtaq very eloquently said in his talk, we haven't always developed that. We haven't always seen it's important. But the good news is again, he demonstrated it, and I've seen a lot of research on this, it is amazing how quickly you can develop it. Even in where people worry about a younger generation who lost the ability to empathize because they're all dealing with their laptops and iPads and communicating in lots of funny ways. You put them in environments, and I'm a big advocate of this, like social action and volunteering. So you put them in environments different. You put them in an environment where they have to learn that their rather privileged view of the world is not the same as everybody else's. And guess what? That muscle, which might have got a little atrophied, in the way that they've grown up on that, is very quick to redevelop because it's such an innate human thing. Yes. And it is one of the things that I believe, at the end of the day, makes us most human.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. This is a general question for the panel. How would the learning sector provide regular, bite-sized, advanced education, not just a 3-year binge as a young adult, ? I'll read that again. How would the learning sector provide regular, bite-sized, advanced education, not just a 3-year binge as a young adult? Mushtaq, you're looking at me?
Yeah, I really think that it's not about providing, but it's about that learning culture. So now if anyone wants to learn anything, and we've been hearing this, your kids are learning from YouTube, there are massive open online courses free of extremely high quality of almost anything that you can think of. So I really think that it's a mindset change. So it's rather than you wait for a learning center to give you something in whatever dose, is for we as individuals to take charge of our own development. I think that's very, very important. And then we just go and we decide that that's what we need to learn, and we learn it.
Robin?
Yeah, so I do think that the center can play a big role in curation. So the biggest challenge right now is if you want to learn something and you do a search, you get such an overwhelming amount of information. And so having some help in terms of curating what is some of the best content can be a huge, huge opportunity. The second thing is for employers, I say give people time, because it is the most precious thing we have. And you come in every day, and there are some organizations and some companies that have done a really good job saying there is a % of time you get to do this. So allocate a few hours a week where you give people permission to learn. And it could be a shadowing program. It could be go and learn something through curated materials. It can be so many different ways. But that ability to take time to learn should be valued. It shouldn't be considered extra or a waste of time or anything else, but actually put a value on it. And people will find that valuable as well.
Jackie?
Yeah, just a very quick supplementary to that, and I think there's a role in there for recognition and qualification. There's something around people valuing discovery, which is great, and people, taking the initiative to pursue their own curiosities and development in the vast array of uncurated fake news to everything else out there. So how do you differentiate between becoming an armchair expert through YouTube videos to having something that is going to be of value to you in your career and of value to your employer? So I think there is something about the role of recognition and qualifications in there that needs a bit more work, probably.
Anthony, do you have anything else to add?
No,
Okay.
nothing to add to that one.
Okay, thank you. The next general panel question. Are we all complicit in not challenging teachers to be more agile, adaptive or innovative? Are we all complicit in not challenging teachers to be more agile, adaptive or innovative? Anthony, do you want to take that one?
That's it.
The rest of the guys,
Yeah.
the rest of the guys bung me a fiver to start at this end.
I think it's called a hospital pass, isn't it?
Live streaming to about 2 million people, I believe.
I think sort of like probably in Scotland and around the world, teachers have really responded to what's been asked of them.
Yeah.
And so if you look in, kind of country after country, more and more young people are staying in education longer. They're achieving sort of qualifications, which used to be a minority. But they're going to university now. What percentage of young Scots are going to university now? It's really high, isn't it? I just come back from Korea, where it's over 80% are going to university, and so teachers have been directed by kind of governments and encouraged and coerced and enabled and supported and different ways to get kids through exams, and they've done a really good job at that. And I think perhaps we should pause to sort of kind of celebrate what education systems have done. But yet at the same time, if you look at some of the other indicators of how well placed young people are as they go into the labour market, you would expect the trend you'd expect to see is that as their human capital as they leave education increases, their employability increases, and you can test this in terms of things like the comparative rates of ratios of earnings or of unemployment, and you can look at kind of the proportion of young people who have low or high pay now and suppose 15 years ago, and people like the Resolution Foundation in this country have done really interesting work there. And what you find is that young employers effectively are discriminating against young people. So at the same time as their qualifications are going through the roof, their earnings or their employment prospects aren't. And that says something about, I suppose, the way that perhaps we've had a too narrow focus within our education systems, simply upon the accumulation of knowledge. And I think what we're talking about earlier is about in terms of emotional intelligence is we need, it's not just the knowledge itself, it's the ability to apply the knowledge, but it's the ability to be personally effective in applying that knowledge in new and changing situations. I think that's what we want to see. And I think probably a lot of teachers are up for that and up for that sort of teaching approach. I'm not sure I feel too complicit, but I think there is an issue there and it does deserve addressing.
Thank you. Anybody else, like Robin?
It's all about giving teachers freedom, just like we were hearing earlier about in social care. It's the same thing. Is teachers don't go into that industry. They don't become teachers because they want to just teach to the test. They don't do it because they just want to go through the motions. They go because they care about student learning. And the more we can give some freedom to that, I think it's really important. There can be clear learning outcomes that we ask the teachers to teach, but how they get there, it should be really left to the teachers to figure out. And I think there is a tremendous movement, and this is across the world. As I talk to many, many, many high school and middle school teachers about trying to figure out how do they break through, because they realize that it's important for them to prepare those students that are then going to go on and join the workforce.
Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot to teachers and schools and young people as well about some of the things we've been talking about today. And I agree. I think teachers do want to do a good job. They do want to help prepare their people, their students for the future. The problem is they exist in a system, and that system has been very, very controlled. And I've long been frustrated with conversations that I've had sometimes with the educational establishment, business and government. And in this country, you see an educational establishment often has been too resistant to change, too tied into the past and its ways of teaching and its curricula and all these other things. And so then you find, and I think it's true in the United States as well, then you find organizations like Minerva or the growth of academy schools and people trying different things, but they're trying to do it almost despite the system. And that's one of our bigger challenges, I think. But as we've all explored, I think, you could say, all right, how do I challenge the system? And I think there's got to be a lot of challenge there. There's got to be a lot more debate with the educational establishment. What are we really preparing young people for now? So that we shift the national curriculum. We shift away from some of the things I said before, which is way too much specialization, way too much fact and repeat fact learning, when every young person knows, well, why do I have to do that? I can Google it in 2 seconds,
Yes.
And then curate the good stuff to me that I really need to know.
Yeah.
But as I said, we've got agency in this as well. We can shift in our own communities and work with our local schools. They're not all disempowered, but I look at it from a macro level as well, and it does frustrate me in this country. We seem to have a rather resistant, or historically have had a rather resistant educational establishment.
Any other views, panel? Are you happy with that? Okay. Another general panel question, and it's how does age relate to the skills gap? Are skills of the younger generation more suitable for work? Question mark. So the question is, how does age relate to the skills gap, and are skills of the younger generation more suitable for work? You'd like to?
I don't think. No, I mean it's a really interesting question, isn't it? Yeah. Would you agree with me if I said to you that there was age bias in the workplace? Because I think there is. I think there's a lot of age bias in the workplace. I think a lot of organisations, perhaps starting with that mindset, well, if it's all about this technology and all this kind of stuff, then older people don't get that, so it's the younger people. Well, interestingly, first of all, ageing demographics, the fastest growing segment of the workforce in this country is the over 50s. Secondly, the fastest growing segment of the population are getting on to social media, building enterprises and using, it's often that generation as well. And of course, older people do bring very different things to the workplace. They bring a degree of experience. If we worry about the sometimes callow youth who can't interact with others, then older people do this really well. Now, which organizations do this best? I think if you look at, say, a lot of the retailers do this really well. I've worked with a lot of retailers who talk about this idea, we've got 5 generations in the workplace. Well, one of my favorite stories was from one of the big DIY stores. They said they had an active campaign to recruit older people to work in the stores, because they said when somebody comes into a store and you're trying to figure out what drill to buy and how to fix a shelf, you want to talk to somebody like your dad or your mum, right? Because they know how to do that stuff, and they've got the time and they care. They're not so worried about, oh, I've got to check out on my text messages or whatever. They actually want to engage. So the answer is that, of course, young people bring skills to the workforce, and we all know, they tend to be more tech savvy to some degree, but that's a generalization as well. But older people they bring a lot to the workplace, indeed themselves, and we've got to make sure we get rid of age bias as part of the inclusion stuff we do, because we have an aging generation. We have a generation, my generation, baby boomers, I love to say they reinvented a lot of things. Well, guess what? They're reinventing retirement too. And they have to, because it's important for us to keep active. We want to keep active for the most part. And of course, sometimes economically we need to work longer. So I think you've got to look at the merits of all the generations and say, actually, the best combination is when they all work together.
Yeah, indeed. We've sadly run out of time, believe it or not. I've got several other questions. I'll have to say a big thank you to the panel, not only for being so adept at answering the questions from the floor, but I can also thank you for your contribution during the course of today and the presentations, all of which were first class, and I thought blended together. So could you thank the panel, please?